Boom. All right, 3, 2, 1. Rich, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story you have. You've got 20 years as a Navy SEAL commander. You've now then moved on to training future SEALs and looking for the top, attributes, of these people. And of course, the book Attributes that recently came out is talking about the lessons that you've learned. 25, I believe, right? Or the attributes that you're looking for in amongst these leaders. And one of the things that really stood out is reading some of your blog posts as well on your site. Feeling a bit under the weather this week, and thankfully I got my voice back, which is all that matters. And I read the post about the optimal versus peak performance, and it was so timely because I was definitely not at my high peak performance as I usually feel, and just this reminder of this need not to constantly demand peak performance was such a interesting perspective for someone like yourself that's been in the Navy SEALs for 20 years. Talk to me a little bit about what the differences are and why you chose to accentuate on optimal versus constantly asking people to be in their highest peak performance.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. So I think I'm really big on semantics because I think words matter and they hold value and they hold meaning, and distinguishing between different meanings is important to me because I think it helps people just greater understand. Certainly that word, but certainly about themselves. And so the world right now and the market is saturated with a bunch of stuff about peak performance. Peak performance is the way people want to go, and I get it because peak performance is great and it's a great goal. I was often told by people, especially after I got out of the Navy, man, you Navy SEALs, you're like the ultimate peak performers. And I had to disagree because, again, the semantics didn't line up. Peak is an apex. And when you're at an apex, the only way you can go out from an apex is down. And peak often has to be prepared for and planned for and scheduled, right? So the professional athlete, the professional football player, for example, spends his entire week planning and prepping and doing all the things so that he may peak for 3 hours on Sunday. And the business person can do the same thing if they're giving a presentation or a big sales pitch or whatever. But the problem with that is that, especially in the SEAL environment or spec ops environment, you don't know when you're going to need to peak. You're doing things, and the environment's unknown, it's uncertain, and you just have to be prepared, which means you can't be running full out all the time. And so I began to think about it more in terms of optimal. Optimal is really the best you can do. Doing the best you can do in the moment, whatever the best might look like, right? So the best might look like peak. It might look like flow states and everything's clicking and feels great. But sometimes the best is just I'm gutting it out and I'm going step by step. And I thought about my own just SEAL training, for example. And in SEAL training, for those in the audience that may not know, it's incredibly difficult and it's hard. You spend hundreds of hours freezing in the surf zone of Southern California. People from Southern California know how cold the surf can get down there, but other people might not. But I remember just being freezing in the surf zone, and there was nothing peak about my performance. I was just doing the best I could in the moment. And even in combat, sometimes there's nothing peak about the performance. You're doing the best you can. And I found that this was quite synonymous with just everyday life for all of us, right? We can't expect ourselves to be running around all the time at peak. It just doesn't make sense. It's not realistic, nor I think responsible from a health perspective. Because if you're driving to the grocery store, you don't have to peak. I mean, you can relax a little bit. And so, what optimal performance I think allows us to do is create a modulation, a healthy modulation between peak and sleep, right? I mean, and so you can kind of go through your day and say, okay, what do I need to be doing right now? And if there are times that you need to plan and prepare and schedule to peak, then definitely do that because it's great. But especially if you're in challenging situations, if you're ill, if you're struggling, if you're stuck in traffic, right? You can just say, hey, what's the best I can do right now? And it's okay, and just do that.
Yeah, that is the biggest takeaway that I took from it is just this focus on showing up and doing the work, putting in the reputation in. And that is one of the biggest things that people struggle with, right? Because when someone has such a perfection mindset, or they need to be at their best just to be able to train or practice or to put the reputation in it, as you mentioned, it ends in pure frustration. And a lot of people, when they get to certain momentum, this is why most people quit their gym, right? They go really high in the first month in January, and then they miss a day or two, and it ends up in frustration. So they can never get back that momentum. So that was like the biggest thing that I took from it. But were you also focusing on, this need for optimal performance when the high pressure moments come as well? Like, was that something that you were also alluding to?
Yeah, absolutely. And specifically when those high pressure moments come without you being prepared or knowing, right? This is where uncertainty, challenge, and stress. I mean, so let's just give the athletes a nod here. Athletes know. I would imagine, and I could bet a lot of money on this, that no athlete would say that their pathway to their elite performance was peak all the time, right? I mean, these guys and gals work their butts off, and some days are just horrible, and they feel bad, and the workouts don't feel very good, and they just grind it out, right? They are doing the best they can. They're performing optimally so that they may peak when they want to. And so when we talk about optimal performance instead of peak, sometimes when things happen that we have not anticipated, this is that illness we come down with, the traffic we're stuck in, or worse, right? Something just tragic happens, or in the SEAL sense, you're in combat, right? You're in a pretty bad gunfight. You then must say to yourself, I'm going to do the very best I can right now, whatever that looks like, because all I can do is move forward, just take steps. And we have to be okay with the fact that may be ugly and dirty and gritty and might not feel very good, but as long as you're stepping through, as long as you're moving forward, you are performing optimally. And hopefully at some point, if you've trained, if you practiced, and there's some familiarity in the environment, you can peak in those situations as well. But more realistically, we're going to be optimal. And here's a great example for all of us, because we all can relate to this. 2020, all right? When we're in 2020 and suddenly COVID hit and we're all quarantined, okay? None of us, I would imagine, none of us would say we were peaking in that moment in our performance. We were all just hit with this hugely uncertain environment, all these unknowns. And we got up the next morning, trapped in our houses, and we're like, okay, gosh, what the hell do I do, right? And we began just doing the best we could. That's optimal performance, and that's really something to remember, especially when challenge, uncertainty, and stress hits.
Absolutely, and this is why this idea of optimal versus peak on a daily basis, just putting those repetitions in, was so crucial for me, because I think when you're talking about those big moments where, as a Navy SEAL, it's the big day, or it's your UFC fighter and you need to perform out there, or you're a basketball player, or you're a business person doing that big presentation. These days where you're putting in the reputation in, whether you feel at high performance or not, whether you feel optimal, it allows you so that if those situations come, whether you're feeling under the weather or you have an injury as an athlete, your optimal is at least higher than the average person. So even when you're feeling challenged, you're still able to perform at a higher level than or perhaps your competition, or even your previous self, which is probably the biggest competition of all, right?
Oh, totally. And also it helps you reframe what the best is actually defined as, right? For the athlete, for example, who is injured or just spent, right? Their best in that moment might be, hey, I'm going to recover and do nothing. Yeah. And that's okay, right? I mean, and so we have to start asking ourselves, okay, what is the best in this moment? Because it might not be going 100%. It might be going 2% or 5% or 50%. What is the best? And I think it's permission to modulate, which is important.
Yeah, definitely. What I wanted to get into it with you, Rich, is you've not only been a high performer for your entire career, but you've also looked for and trained other people to become high performers. And I wanted to get an idea of like, what are some of these core pillars? Maybe a better way to put it is like, if you found the laziest person you could ever find, someone like couch potato eating Doritos on, every day, watching Game of Thrones or Queens of Gambit, you name it. And you wanted to take this person from where they are to, the highest peak performance, to their personal ability, to their optimal and high peak performance. What are some of the core 2 to 3 pillars you would establish in their lives, from day one, that can really help them take that leap?
Yeah, what a fantastic question. I think the number one most important thing to consider that I would certainly recommend would be know thyself. So we're all, especially today in today's environment, we all have to remember that we're all human, because unity is important, and we are all human. However, we are all different. So if we related to automobiles, for example, we're all cars. Okay, we're all some sort of automobile. But some of us are Jeeps, and some of us are Ferraris, and some of us are SUVs. And there's no judgment there, right? Because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. The question becomes, what type of vehicle are we? And to recognize that, we have to look under the hood and start figuring that out, because we may in fact be a Jeep trying to run on a Ferrari track, or a Ferrari trying to run on a Jeep track. And it's actually one of my favorite quotes, an Albert Einstein quote that says, and I might butcher it here, but it says, everybody's a genius, but if you ask a fish to climb a tree, he'll spend his entire life thinking he's an idiot, right? The key is context, right? And so the key is, first figure out what type of vehicle you are, so that you may say, okay, if I'm a Jeep, then I should start looking for the Jeep tracks, right? Because I can do my best on a Jeep track. Or if I'm a Ferrari, I can do my best on the Ferrari track. So number one is know thyself. And so this is where we begin to not prejudge things like attributes, these innate qualities, because some of us have more than others. My attributes, our attribute set, unbeknownst to me, I guess, fit pretty well in the SEAL environment. Okay, probably, it certainly doesn't fit well in other environments. That my attribute set doesn't. So first thing is know thyself, and understand what engine you have, understand what set of attributes you have, and don't judge it, because it'd be like me getting ticked off that my hair is not blonde, right? There's nothing I can control. It's our set. And then say, okay, given that, what can I then look to excel at? Because that person who is sitting on the couch, watching Game of Thrones, eating potato chips, right? Unless it's a pre-planned escape period, which is completely okay. But if it's consistent, right, then what that probably means is that person is not, their lives aren't effectively reflecting their strengths.
Yeah.
They're the fish trying to climb the tree, and it's not working, rather than figuring out where to climb. So I think that's the number one pillar for anybody to start thinking about how they can start exploring and reaching their potential.
To dig into that, are there some real life examples that you've seen from training other people, or even in yourself? Like one of the things that I can think about for my own personal life is, I've got one of my good friends here, and I personally love to lift weights and go to the gym and do CrossFit. That's like my lane, and it just fits for me. I feel energetic after I've done it. And I've always tried to get this friend to come with me, and he's just not convinced, right? And he's not like super unhealthy or anything like that, but he's definitely not at his optimal self. And whenever I try to get it to go to the gym with him, there was no motivation for him, and he always associates getting fit with lifting weights, when in fact there are so many different ways to get in shape, whether you're lifting weights or not. And eventually he was able to find sports, and he was able to find things like running and biking, things that involve more outdoor activity. Outdoor was the biggest thing. And,
right.
If he was always to stick in his lane of trying to lift weights, he would have just sat on his couch, and he would have associated exercise as being a bad thing or draining thing. And that's like a big thing that I think you're referring to as just one example of many that we look into.
I totally agree, and this is it's an example of how we're all different, right? And because of our unique set of qualities, that different things are going to drive us differently, right? Here's a personal example. I played sports when I was in high school. I never really enjoyed sports. I'm not a very competitive person. I mean, I should say I played lacrosse. I like the stick work. I like the kind of the intricacy of the board. I like the teamwork. In terms of winning or losing, it never really bothered me. So sports for me was never a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
However, I do love running. I do love weightlifting. When I work out, I like doing it kind of by myself, doing my own thing. Other than I did enjoy the SEAL, the team guy PTs and things like that. But there was a little bit of competition, but it was really just to get in shape. My sons are the same way. They look at sports and are like, they don't have a lot of interest in that kind of competitive sport nature, so kind of the competitive sports genre, right? So in terms of fitness, my wife and I have had to introduce different activities to them so that they stay fit and healthy, riding bikes, working out on their own, working out with a partner or whatever, something different than athletics, right? So for some people, athletics is a perfect way to stay in shape, and stay healthy because they just love the competitiveness. It's moving. It's just other people like myself and my boys, we and my wife too, actually, we do other things, so it's about understanding. Again, it's about understanding your own engine. Don't try to fit yourself in the mode. I think one key attribute that comes to mind that's really important in all of this is open-mindedness. I think the ability to kind of set aside any preconceived notions and kind of let in some other perspectives is probably what you got your friend to start exploring some other avenues of fitness, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's all of this. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool.
New world.
I can stay fit by hiking up a mountain. That's cool. So I think open-mindedness is key for anybody who might feel like they're in a rut.
Definitely. Now, one of the things that you've kind of introed into before talking about, some of these attributes, the 25 attributes that you talk about in the book, is you mentioned that you saw a lot of these leaders, a lot of these performers that had the right skill, right? And they were still unable to succeed or at least reach that highest level. And I think we all can relate to that person. We all see that person that is incredibly talented, that just never gets to the spotlight, whether it's an athlete or an actor or a business person or Navy SEAL. So I guess, what do you find are some of these key differences? I know this is kind of like your entire book, but what are some of these, just to kind of intro you into talking about some of the attributes, what are some of these big differences that is, the key for the reason why some of these people that have the right skills can't succeed and reach their highest level?
Yeah. Well, you're right. This is kind of the thesis, and the thesis is that there's a distinct difference between skills and attributes, and this is what the book kind of describes. And it's attributes that actually drive our behavior and drive our ability to achieve and make things happen and kind of move through challenge and uncertainty. And so just kind of lay it out for your audience, I think, skills are not innate. They're not inherent to our nature. Okay. None of us are born with the ability to throw a ball or ride a bike or drive a car or whatever, or in the SEAL case, shoot a gun. We're taught those things, or we can train to do those things. And as such, they direct our behavior in known specific situations, right? So here's how and when to throw a ball. Here's how and when to ride a bike. Here's how and when to shoot a gun.
Right.
And because they're kind of visible and they're distinguishable, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can see how well anybody does any one of those things, and they can be scored, for example. Now, this is why most teams and businesses get seduced by skills in their selection and assessment processes, because it's very easy to see them. And they can be measured, and you can write them on a resume, and you can see them in sales numbers, or you can see how well someone does graphic design or whatever. The problem with skills is they don't tell the story on how people are going to show up and perform when things are uncertain and unknown, and the plan goes south and sideways. Because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill to an unknown environment.
Right.
Okay. So this is where we begin to lean on our attributes. Attributes are inherent. Okay. We're all born with certain levels of adaptability or resilience or discipline. Okay. Now we certainly develop these over time, environment, nature, nurture kind of thing. But you can see levels of this stuff in small kids. They also inform our behavior rather than direct behavior, right? So they tell us how we're going to show up to a situation. My son's levels of resilience and perseverance, for example, informed me as to how he was going to show up when he was learning how to ride his bike for the first time and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. Okay. Because they're hidden in the background, they are very hard to assess, measure, and test. Okay. You can't see them as easily. Okay. You can't sit down across from someone at an interview, for example, and assess how adaptable they are.
Right.
Okay. It just doesn't work that way. So the best and most visible environments that you can see these things are environments of challenge, uncertainty, and stress, right? This is where they start coming out, and we start leaning on this. This is why, me running, doing this in the SEAL teams and running SEAL training, with such a perfect laboratory, because SEAL training is all about challenge, uncertainty, and stress. So this starts to explain why certain people who seem to have all the right skills and seem to be somewhat naturally talented at the skills portions of it don't necessarily succeed to the levels, because any pathway to success is going to involve uncertainty, challenge, stress, and therefore it's going to involve attributes as well. So if people are deficient in some of these attributes, then it doesn't allow them to get through those necessary wickets appropriately and then find their way to ultimate success. So I think that's kind of a basic way to lay it out. And again, I would say that it also depends on what lane you're trying to run in based on the levels of attributes you have. I was a pretty darn good SEAL, right, in terms of the attribute list I brought to the table. I'm not a very good athlete, right, which tells me and tells us all that the list of attributes required to be an athlete in certain sports is going to be different than the list of attributes required to be a SEAL. Okay, so every context is a little bit different. That list looks differently for whatever it is you want to do.
You'd figure it'd be quite similar. What are the differences of the Navy? Because it's interesting that you said that you weren't super competitive, but I always figure that being a Navy SEAL with all the training and all the things that you have to do to constantly push yourself require some level of competing with other people around you so that you can really step up to, that peak level performance. What are the key differences you would say in terms of attributes for a Navy SEAL versus, a high performance athlete?
Well, so we have to talk about the sports, right? Because sports matter, because the different whatever sport you're in matters. First, I'll answer the second question first, and that is the special operations community, SEALs included. They favor both the competitive and the non-competitive gene, right? Or our attribute, I should say. I'm more non-competitive. In other words, what does that mean? That means when I see a crowd of people doing something, I'm kind of like, I have no real inclination or desire to compete. I'm going to think of another way. All right. That becomes extraordinarily important when you're talking about environments inside of which it's a requirement to think about things differently than the enemy might think about them. Right. Now, there are also competitive dudes in the SEAL teams, right? Because sometimes you have to run straight up the line. Sometimes it's about, hey, we're going to go mano a mano and we need to win this thing. How do we win? So my belief is any high performing team, other than maybe athletics, but any high-performing team, like in business or spec ops, is enhanced by having both polarities. Okay, because the competitive mind thinks about an environment in a very specific, defined way, and says, okay, how can I win inside of this environment with these rules and conditions? The non-competitive mind says, I don't really care about the rules and conditions. What's some other ways we can do it, right? So that's the difference there. I would say when we talk about athletics, the biggest difference in athletics, and I'm going to caveat this because there are some sports that are not as similar, and I'll talk about those. But say take football or basketball or even baseball. Okay, the environment for those types of sports is very certain. Okay, we know everybody on that baseball field, football field, basketball. They know exactly what's going to happen inside. They know the time frames. They know the lanes and the boundaries. They know the rules. Okay, so they have a very conditioned environment with all these rules and boundaries inside of which they can compete. Okay, very, very little uncertainty. All right. In the spec ops world, in the SEAL world, we don't. So take football field. We didn't have a 50 by 100-yard box inside of which we knew the rules. Okay, all we had were some skills that we were trained to, and then we had attributes so that we could be dropped anywhere, anytime, and figure it out.
Yeah.
All right. We had to lean. We were designed to operate in what's called VUCA environments. VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments. That's VUCA, and it's kind of this VUCA world. VUCA, right? Yeah. So, and so that's really the bent of any spec ops team, or really any military team, and that's the biggest difference between, say, soldiers and athletes. Now, the caveat: there are some sports out there that actually do represent a little bit more of the uncertainty, right? I would put fighting sports in that category, okay? Because a fighter, a UFC fighter, he or she can train all day long. Okay, this move, that, and they could be really good at the moves, but once they get into the ring with that other human being, they become highly adaptable. Okay,
completely.
Kind of like Mike Tyson's thing. Every plan, no plan survives the first punch in the face, right? Or everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face the first time, right?
Yeah.
So in a combat sports environment, you have to actually have a bunch of adaptability because the environment is changing. It's uncertain, because you just don't. You could say, I'm going to do this, this, and this, but as soon as you do this, the opponent might do something you never even planned.
Right.
So I would say rock climbing, or certain types of rock climbing, is probably the same thing. I mean, that climber can look at the face of a cliff and say, okay, the top is where I want to go. Okay, I think as I see it, I think I have a pretty good path, right? But as soon as that climber starts to climb, they're going to start noticing what knotholes work and what don't. They're going to have to change. They may have to change their plan. The weather might come in. There's a bunch of stuff, right? So the rules aren't as set in some of those sports. So there are certainly some sports that are more applicable. But again, of course, the physicality is very applicable. So there are some similarities and differences, but I think in the environment are the biggest differences between the two.
Yeah, it seems like adaptability is like the big one, where you can come into a situation that's very uncertain and figure out what you kind of mold your way through and kind of ride the wave instead of going against it. Is that something you can teach? Is adaptability something that people are just generally born with and you just can't really change it? Or can you really train someone or yourself, just the average Joe, to feel more comfortable with uncertainty and to help them train to navigate themselves in an adaptable manner?
Yeah. So here's where semantics matter. You can certainly develop adaptability, but you can't teach it. So here's the back of the envelope test to determine whether or not something's a skill or an attribute, because they get conflated all the time, is, can it be taught or can I teach it? All right. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So for example, Sean, if you say, hey, Rich, I'm not adaptable at all. I need to become more adaptable. Well, I couldn't sit down with you and teach you a class on adaptability. It doesn't work that way. So I can't teach you adaptability. You can't be taught it. You can, however, develop attributes that you're low on. So in other words, you could say, okay, I want to be more adaptable, and so it has to be self-motivated. It has to be self-directed, and then it's going to take you as an individual to decide to step into environments that test and develop your adaptability, right? You will have to throw yourself deliberately into discomfort so that you may test it. Patience is a great example because it's easy and it's kind of funny, right? If you want to develop patience, or anybody want to develop patience, you can't sit down and teach a class on how to be more patient. But what you're going to have to do is say, I want to be more patient. And now I'm going to have to find environments and throw myself into environments that test my patience. Okay, I'm going to go to the DMV every day and do something, whatever it is. But it's going to be a little bit more uncomfortable because your tendencies, or you're a little bit lower on those attributes. But yes, you can develop it. It takes self-motivation, self-direction, and a willingness to throw oneself into discomfort.
Yeah, this is fascinating because this distinguishing of what you can teach and what you have to self-motivate yourself to do yourself seems to be like one of the key fundamentals in terms of being able to filter out from the key of masses and figure out who the top performers are, who has the highest potential are, one of the things you've had to do was to kind of weed out some of the Navy SEALs and pick out who are going to be the top leaders. In that essence, for someone that maybe is an entrepreneur or someone that is a manager, anyone that's trying to select other people to work with them, is that a key distinguisher where you want to look for these people that have these fundamental attributes? Because as you mentioned, skills can be taught, right? You can take them to a class, you can help them teach the core skill sets, but it's very difficult to teach them, or if not impossible, to teach them the attributes. So is that one of the key lessons there, is like you want to be looking for people that have attributes, not necessarily these skill sets which can easily be taught?
Yeah, 100%. And again, so just to make sure everybody understands, skills do matter. Okay, it's especially depending on the level. Again, if you're hiring for a business, you're going to want someone who has some skill, right? I should not be hired to be a quarterback on a professional football team, for example. I have no skills that would preclude me to do that job, right? So skills do matter to an extent. However, what I would recommend and encourage businesses to do is to not get seduced by skills, because attributes are more important if you're dealing inside of an environment that's somewhat ambiguous and can change and be dynamic, which is, oh, by the way, most environments. Okay. Yeah. Don't get seduced by just skills. Look at attributes, because again, if you have the requisite attributes, which is what we found in the SEAL teams, okay, if you have the requisite attributes that we're looking for, we can always teach you how to shoot. We can always teach you how to skydive, okay? We can always teach you how to scuba dive. We can teach you how to do all these things because you have the attributes that are required. Now, it's going to depend, each business, each team, each organization, they're all going to have to do they're going to have to do work on their own to figure out what that list looks like, because the list of attributes that required to be a Navy SEAL going to be different than the list of attributes required to be a great accountant or a salesperson or a nurse or a teacher. So first understand what that list is, and then when you're training and assessing and selecting, keep that list in mind, because that's really what you want to think about and focus on.
Got it. When you've gone out and trained all of these leaders for your Navy SEAL training, you've looked at probably thousands of different people and different attributes that are required to become the top leader. Is there any skill that comes to mind that you find have been the most underrated? Skill
or attribute?
Good question, actually. Let's say attribute.
Okay, attribute, yeah. So in the book, I talk about 5 leadership attributes, and I think these are the 5 that are required for great leadership. But before I get into that, we just have to level the bubble here on leadership and what it is. People often get confused between being in charge and being a leader, because they're not the same thing. Being in charge is a noun, and leadership is a verb. And you don't get to self-designate, okay? You don't get to call yourself a leader. That's like calling yourself good-looking or funny, all right? You don't get to decide that. Other people decide. Other people decide whether or not they look at you and consider you a leader, and whether or not they're going to follow you. And you don't force the issue. And that's done based on the behaviors that you express. If you express the appropriate behaviors, they will then make that decision. So leadership is a behavior, not a position. And the behaviors that are most common for great leaders, and I say this because I've done now leadership work for the last 4 years since retiring from the military, and one of the things we do is we go around to audiences all over the world and we say, okay, we're asking a simple question: what do great leaders do? And people just start answering, and we start making lists, and we have thousands of these lists, okay, that we've created all around the world. Every list is pretty much the same. Okay, it's the same stuff every time. It doesn't matter if we're talking to people in the U.S., people outside the U.S. Doesn't matter if we're talking to millennials or Gen Xers or baby boomers. It has no bearing. People understand what the behaviors of leadership are. Okay, and the 5 attributes that I outline in the book are key, elemental. They're always on the list. They're elemental to those behaviors. So they are empathy, selflessness, accountability, authenticity, and decisiveness. So those 5 behaviors typically generate a belief in other people to say, okay, this person is someone I want to follow. This is someone I consider a leader. And so that's what it is. If you want to be a leader, you can be in charge. That's easy. When I was in the military, I was an officer. So pretty much all the time, I was always in charge of something. Okay. Now, whether or not I was a leader was based on those people who were in my span of care. And I guarantee you, well, I'll tell you this, there are definitely people who have contacted me either when I was in the Navy or later, said, hey, Rich, I just loved serving for you. Thanks for being a great leader. Okay. So I know that I, with those people, displayed leadership behaviors that allowed them to say that. Guarantee you there's a ton of people out there who I was in charge of who looked at me and was like, well, that's just the guy in charge, because I wasn't behaving in a way that allowed them to make that decision. Right. So if you want to be a leader, you have to behave like one, and then let people decide.
Yeah. So I guess as one of the final things that I wanted to go over with you here is visualization. One of the things that I'm sure you know, as a Navy SEAL, you've trained people to do is focus on developing kind of the visual mind in terms of really trying to picture all the little sequences that you can imagine. And this is something I do before every podcast. It truly does make a big difference. What are some of the things that you've been taught about how to apply visualization in terms of reaching your highest performance?
Yeah, I love visualization, and it's something we brought into the teams and talked about. It was really up to every guy as to whether or not they wanted to try it or implement it. However, I'm kind of fascinated with the kind of the neurology of it, and the neurology is pretty clear, and that is our mind. If we can visualize a situation, whether it be practice, skill, or whatever, or an environment, the more detailed and in depth we can kind of create that visualization in our heads, our brains don't necessarily know the difference between real and imagined or visualized, which means we can actually take a lot of our practicing into the visualization category without having to do the physical practice. So I definitely encourage it. And now visualization, I think, is most effective when you want to practice and train to skills, because again, you have to be able to visualize a known environment, right? So you can visualize, shooting a gun. You can visualize throwing a football or kicking a football or anything like that, anything known. I think when it comes to unknown environments, and this is where attributes come in mostly, it's tough to visualize the unknown environment. That's where you just have to really kind of lean on experience. And so one of the best ways, I wouldn't say the only way, but it's certainly one of the best ways to practice uncertainty is to just throw yourself into unknown environments, more often than not. I think I was fortunate to be able to do that as a young kid who's wanted to be a Navy SEAL, and I just threw myself into that environment. And then sometimes we get hit with unknown environments, right? 2020 was an unknown environment we all got hit with. So a lot of people, everybody has a kind of a great experience upon which they can look back and say, okay, when I was thrown into this unknown environment of 2020 and COVID, how did I perform? What was I deficient on? What was I a little bit more, or better at? And they can kind of look at that, but it takes experience to try to develop these attributes and figure out where we stand. And visualization, awesome tool, and I use it myself more for known skills.
Right. And I guess in terms of, to make that a little bit more actionable for people, I guess really what it comes down to is courage, right? Like for people to be throwing themselves into these situations, it comes down to getting over your fears and to actually doing the thing. And sometimes it's just things like COVID. You just get thrown into these situations and you can't really do anything about it. And whether you feel ready or not, whether you feel scared or not, that's just the situation that you get into. I think you talked about a little bit about, this idea of building more courage. And one of the things that I took away from that was like, it's not these Navy SEALs or these people don't have fear, right? I think that's kind of the misconception is that like people think these guys are fearless. That's kind of the key word that we use in our regular vocabulary. But it's sometimes like using the fear to be able to do the things that you want to do at a peak level. Talk to us a little bit about that as a way to kind of close this off.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, courage cannot exist in the absence of fear. Fear is required for courage to even exist. And the reason is because courage is actually a switch in our brain. Courage is actually something that's happening, and it's actually our decision to move and step into our fear. Okay, it's the fight. It's the fight response. Out of the fight and flight response, courage is the fight response. And again, it doesn't have to mean, put up your dukes and actually fight like that. It just means stepping into that which is frightening us. It's giving us anxiety. And when we do that, when that switch gets flipped in our brain, we get a dopamine reward. That's a dopamine, a very powerful neurotransmitter. A lot of us know exactly what that is. But it basically tells us, hey, this is good. This feels good. Keep doing it. It's why it's kind of the underpinning of almost every addiction out there, because almost every addiction is basically generating dopamine. And it's not really the dopamine that's making us feel good. It's the dopamine saying, hey, this does feel good. Keep doing this. That's what it's doing. So we get the same dopamine hit when we step into our fear. And again, I would say everybody can probably think of a time where they did something that was making them nervous or anxious or afraid, and they did it and they accomplished it and they felt awesome. Well, they're being flooded with dopamine. Okay. The interesting thing about dopamine and fear is that we're designed neurologically and evolutionarily to get that hit every time we take a step. So we don't even have to wait until we're done with the project or done with the challenge. Every time we take a step forward into it, we're getting another hit. And that's by design, because we were supposed to be, as humans, we're designed to be exploratory, to kind of keep going, to kind of discover. When we were, back in caveman days, when the resources were running dry in the area, we needed to go find new resources or find a new area to live. Okay, that took courage. It took an ability to step forward and take those steps. And it wasn't, our bodies didn't wait to reward us when we got to the new land of plenty, right? It had to reward us while we kind of kept going, because that's what helped get us through the journey to get there. So we can take this into an everyday example, or any everyday example, and just say, hey, if you step into that which is making you anxious and fearful, you will be rewarded. And you can try to start to feel that and process that, and it'll just help encourage you to do it more often.
Love it. Love it. Well, I think that's such a powerful way to close this off, Rich. Obviously we've touched on some of these key things around leadership, visualization, finding courage, the difference between like attributes versus skill. I think all of these things are things that we can probably spend an hour on each, but thankfully you've got your book, The Attributes, to cover some of these things that we go into in a much deeper depth. So I highly encourage for people to check that out. We'll definitely link that in our show notes below for people to check out. Rich, really want to thank you for your time and for sharing this knowledge. Where can people find more about the attributes, what you're up to, and the work that you've been putting out?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thanks for having me. Best place is theattributes.com, the website, theattributes.com. We have you can get the book there. We have assessment tools that we put on there for free that you can take, and you see where you stand on the grit attributes, the drive attributes, and the mental acuity attributes. You can take those for free. I've thrown some workbooks on there to help people if they want to develop any attributes or each attribute. They can get a workbook, and there's some ideas and tools that you can use to develop those. And then I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn as well, so you can hit me up there. And I appreciate any visits or support.
Amazing. All right, thanks so much, guys. See you guys next time.